Good evening, everyone. My name is Jen Wesson. I am the Executive Director of the Head of the Schuylkill Regatta. And on behalf of the Board of Directors and the Committee 50, we welcome you to our 23rd Story Hour, the beginnings of the Royal Canadian Henley Regatta. I want to review just a couple housekeeping items to help with the sound and the flow this evening. We continue to use this Zoom platform because we feel it's important to see one another, everyone's reactions, laughter, smiles. We feel really strongly that storytellers are not only sharing with us, but that we are sharing with them. And most of the time in recognition of and appreciation for their contributions and successes in our community. So I have muted everyone to eliminate any background noise, but you have the ability to unmute yourself at any point in time. So please be mindful of any background noise if you do so. We encourage you to use the chat room to ask questions or to add to stories. And please go ahead and say hello in the chat room. Tell us where you're calling from today, and maybe any type of history that you have with the Canadian Henley. We will allow time at the end for questions and commentary. We usually run to about 8:15 at the latest. In addition, everyone should be aware that I am recording this session today, so it'll be available for those that were unable to join us. We'll get it posted as quickly as possible within the next 24 hours on our YouTube page, and I will share it back out with our registration sign up list. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our facilitator for the evening and our 50 committee member, Stephen Malbouef, to introduce our topic and speaker for this evening. Stephen is an architectural designer and historian with a passion for rowing. In middle school, Stephen took interest in the Detroit Boat Club, one of North America's oldest rowing organizations, mostly to be able to get close to the historic Belle Island Boathouse. Stephen is now a member of the Friends of Detroit Rowing, their resident historian, and has spent the past years creating a detailed architectural analysis of the Belle Isle Boathouse, which was pivotal in demonstrating the building's potential to be restored. So you are in for a lovely story this evening. Thanks for spending time with us. With no further ado, Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. As Jen said, my name is Stephen Malbouef, and I'm the historian for the Detroit Boat Club. I have been emailing back and forth with Stan for the last 6 years, as the history of the Detroit Boat Club wouldn't be complete without the Royal Canadian Henley Regatta. The Canadian Henley has been the traditional favorite regatta of the DBC since the 1890s, and that eventually grew to the DBC seeming to have a closer relationship with many of the Canadian rowing crews than they did with the American ones, to the point that the DBC was elected as the first American club to be an honorary member of the Canadian Association of Amateur Oarsmen in 1921. What Stan has accomplished in researching the history of Canadian Henley is incredible. Stan began rowing in the 1960s at Dennis Morris High School in St. Catharines, and then for the St. Catharines Rowing Club, and then Brock University. He began photographing rowing scenes at the Canadian Henley in the 1970s before being asked to photograph winning crews at the grandstand in 1986, a task which he has been doing for nearly 40 years. He is now the official photographer for both the Royal Canadian Henley Regatta as well as the Canadian Secondary Schools Rowing Association Championship Regatta. Stan has compiled the results for every event at every Canadian Henley Regatta over the last 140 years. He has written a book that covers the histories of all 88 perpetual trophies that are currently in competition at the regatta, as well as the 18 that have been retired. And he is currently working on a massive book that covers the entire history of the Royal Canadian Henley Regatta, with a chapter for every year the regatta has taken place. Everything is written, which is now up to 1987, can be found on his website. In addition to what he has compiled for the Canadian Henley, Stan has worked on 3 additional books covering the histories of the rowing crew at Dennis Morris, the St. Catharines Rowing Club, and Brock University Athletics. So now, without further ado, I introduce you to Stan Lapinski.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, got Peter on the mind. Thank you, Stephen. You read that exactly the way I wrote it, so that was good. And I would also like to thank you for inviting me, because you were the person that contacted me and asked me to do this. So for that, I owe you some thanks.
I should say too, yeah, that Stan had told me that he'd given a presentation recently on the Canadian Henley. And so when we were looking for a topic, I was like, oh, Stan has one prepared. And when I reached out to him, he said, well, I do, but it's all on physical slides that I'll have to scan in. So he transformed a physical slideshow into a digital slideshow for today. I thought you'd know.
Actually, that's not quite true. I think there's only one shot from the physical slideshow that's in this particular one, but that's okay.
Oh, okay.
Variety is good. Variety is good. I'd like to acknowledge, I've been seeing some of my friends pop up on the screen there, people that I know. Thank you for joining us. And I'd like to acknowledge two people in particular. Carol Purser is here, and Carol is a friend and also the president of Rowing Canada Aviron. So it's good to have her in the audience here. And also, I don't think he's in yet, but Bill Shank will be joining us if he hasn't already. Bill has been until 2023 the Henley Commissioner. And what that means is, to paraphrase Harry Truman, the buck stopped with him. So he did everything. And Bill has been a good friend for many, many years. So I'd like to especially acknowledge their presence here tonight. Now, if all works, I'll be able to put these slides up here. Okay, are we in business? Can you see that, Stephen?
It looks beautiful.
Okay. Rowing was extremely popular in Canada in the 19th century, both as a sport to participate in and to watch. Canada's first sports heroes and world champions was a straight four from St. John, New Brunswick. The crew was composed of lighthouse keeper Elijah Ross and three fishermen, George Price, Sam Hutton, and Robert Fulton. On July 7, 1867, while Canadians were celebrating Confederation, that four was competing at the Paris Exposition. Rowing on the Seine River, they beat three French crews, two English crews, one from the London Rowing Club, the other from Oxford University, and a German crew to become world champions. And of course, we have all heard of Ned Hanlon, Canada's greatest sports hero of the 19th century. So yes, rowing was popular in Canada. If you have read William Lanowit's book, The Triumph of the Amateurs, you know about the problems that were part of professional rowing. As a reaction to the abuses, in 1872, the National Association of Amateur Oarsmen was organized. It was the first American sports organization to publish a definition of amateur. In 1873, the first national championship regatta was held in Philadelphia. Canada was not far behind. The intention to organize a governing body of amateur rowing was published on page 4 of the April 5th, 1880 edition of the Toronto Globe. It consists of one sentence, 4 lines, in the middle of an article entitled Annual Meeting of the Argonaut Rowing Club. And that one sentence reads, the question of forming a national amateur rowing association for the Dominion of Canada was discussed, and delegates appointed to attend the meeting here on the 9th last. Unquote. The Canadian Association of Amateur Oarsmen was founded at that meeting on April 9th, 1880. As with the NAAO, the word amateur was the key part of the organization's name. Over the years, it would create some odd situations. For example, there were several instances of men who rowed but played professional hockey. They were banned from CAAO regattas. Anyway, the CAAO immediately set about organizing a regatta. The first regatta of the Canadian Association of Amateur Oarsmen was held on Toronto Harbor, August 4th and 5th, 1880. Notice it's not called a Royal Canadian Henley Regatta. even though Wikipedia says Queen Victoria gave her consent to the use of the name. It did not happen. There were 8 finals, and the regatta was supposed to take 1 day, but the weather forced a change in plans. Many races had been held on Toronto Harbor, so the conditions were well known. As a result, 2 courses were laid out. One close to the city and one farther away, close to Toronto Island, which offered some shelter from the wind. So because the water was too rough near the city, they switched to the course near the island. However, it took a long time to move the shells from the boathouses of the Toronto, Argonaut, and Bayview rowing clubs to the island, hence the long delay. 17 clubs competed, 12 Canadian and 5 American. There were 82 competitors. The event with the most entries was the senior single sculls with 15. The race was run without heats with 11 scullers after 4 scratched. The first winner was Joseph Lang from the Grand Trunk Rowing Club in Montreal. 3 challenge cups were presented. The one for the senior 4 oars has disappeared. It was huge and was probably melted down for the silver. The other 2 are still around. The Challenge Cup for double sculls, more commonly known as the Hop Bitters Challenge Cup, is still presented for the senior men's double. I should mention that a couple of guys from New York AC by the names of Dietz and Klakatsky have their names on it 5 times. Ironically, the names of the first winners, Jay Douglas and Richard Tinning Jr. from the Bayside Rowing Club, do not appear on it. My theory is that their names were inscribed on the lid, which has been lost. When Joseph Lang won the senior single sculls, he was presented with the Challenge Cup for senior singles. Even though a new trophy for the championship singles, the George F. Galt Memorial Trophy, was introduced in 1929, the original Challenge Cup continued to be presented as well. However, at some point, it was set aside and forgotten until Dan Kostick found it in a box of trophy pieces. He and Bill Stevens, who might be one of our participants tonight, raised money in Port Dalhousie to have the urn cleaned and fixed, and it was made the key feature of the People of Port Dalhousie Trophy, which was first presented in 1985. Now, I picked this photo, this slide, weeks ago before I realized or I knew that Carol Purser would be here tonight, but the young lady in red and white on the extreme right there is in fact the president of Rowing Canada, Aviron. Okay, and I shouldn't get too far away from it. Here we are. In spite of taking 2 days to run 8 races, and in spite of the fact that while thousands of spectators lined the Toronto waterfront on the first day and had a good view of the course that was too rough to use, but did not have a good view of the races on the other side of the harbor, in spite of all this, the first regatta of the Canadian Association of Amateur Oarsmen was declared a success. Go figure. The plan was to rotate the annual regatta among a number of venues. In 1881, the second annual regatta of the Canadian Association of Amateur Oarsmen was held in Hamilton, southwest of Toronto. At least that's what the CAAO records say. In reality, it was held at Burlington Beach. The beach is an isthmus which separates Hamilton Bay and Lake Ontario. That geographical feature was one of the attractions for the CAAO. As had been done in Toronto, 2 courses were laid out, one on the west side of the isthmus in the bay and one on the east side of the isthmus on the lake. If one side was rough, the other side could be used. In 1881, they used the lake side, which was only slightly less rough than the bay. Other attractions at the beach included the Ocean House, a posh hotel with many amenities, and the Royal Hamilton Yacht Club, plus hourly train and steamer service from Toronto. In 1882, the third annual regatta was held in Lachine, Quebec, on Lake St. Louis, which is part of the St. Lawrence River. Lachine was then a town on the outskirts of Montreal. Today, it is a part of Montreal. In 1883, the fourth annual regatta was held in Ottawa. This was the worst venue so far. The course was on the Ottawa River, so there was a current against which the competitors rode. Both sides of the river had industries related to wood and lumber, like the Eddy Match Company. These companies pumped toxic gases into the air, which made breathing difficult and burned people's eyes. The water was made up of toxic discharges from the factories. Some days, the surface of the water could not be seen because it was covered with a layer of sawdust. Other days, the sawdust blew in the air, making seeing and breathing difficult. Clogging the river were log booms, collections of thousands of logs enclosed by a boom made up of logs chained together. The booms were floated down from northern Ontario and Quebec and normally filled the river at Ottawa. However, for the regatta, they were moved out of the way. The logs still posed a risk, however, because there was always the chance that a single log might get out of the boom and float into the middle of the river and pose a hazard for competitors. In 1884, the regatta returned to Toronto Harbor, and the rowing fans finally got to see the races because the course close to the city was used. The plan was to rotate the regatta through Toronto, Hamilton, Lachine, and Ottawa. We have to remember that the rowing clubs of the host city organized and paid for the regatta. That became a challenge. In 1891, the regatta was supposed to be held in Ottawa, but they didn't have the people or the money to put it on. But someone on the CAAO executive knew that Barrie, on Lake Simcoe, north of Toronto, was willing to host it. Other regattas, professional and amateur, had been held there, so it seemed worth a try. The alternative was to return to Toronto, but the clubs there were not overly receptive to that idea. In 1891, the regatta is remembered as the one the steamboats ignored. The mile-and-a-half course was laid out on Kempenfelt Bay, which had a lot of steamer traffic. The steamships ignored the regatta and carried on as though it was a normal day for them. One crew, out for a practice row in a brand new fore, had the bow of the boat sheared off by a steamship, and the crew had to be rescued. The captain of the steamer justified his action by saying that the shell was in his water. The regatta never returned to Barrie. After returning to Toronto in 1892, the regatta took up residence in Hamilton, Burlington. The CAAO liked that location, and there was talk of making it the permanent site of the annual regatta. The dual courses and the amenities mentioned earlier were strong attractions, and the men at the Leander Rowing Club and the Nautilus Rowing Club were tireless in working to improve the facilities. Moreover, they had an agreement with the steamboat operators in Burlington Bay that they would not interfere with the races. The regatta stayed in Hamilton, Burlington for 1893, 1894, and 1895, but then the Nautilus Rowing Club disbanded, and the only first-class hotel on the beach, the Ocean House, burned down. It had been the hotel of choice for competitors. With no place to stay and reduced volunteer force, the regatta never returned to Hamilton, Burlington after 1895. However, a new club stepped in for the next two regattas. Brockville Rowing Club asked for and was given the regatta for 1896 and 1897. Its mile-and-a-half course was on the St. Lawrence River. Toronto hosted the regatta in 1898, and Brockville had it again in 1899. The Brockville organizers were granted permission by the CAAO to use a 1.5-mile course with a turn. This had not been used at the previous annual regattas, although it was a common course at other regattas. Toronto also used the turn course in 1900. In 1901, the regatta returned to Ottawa for the first time since 1887. However, because of the terrible conditions mentioned earlier, the CAAO demanded that the regatta not be held in the city, but on the outskirts at Aylmer on Lake Deschênes, which was a part of the Ottawa River. There was little pollution there, but getting there from the city was difficult, and there were no provisions for spectators to see more than the start and finish of the turning race. However, one far-reaching encounter occurred there. As mentioned earlier, the CAAO was looking for a permanent home for its annual regatta. All the sites used had serious drawbacks. They were wide open bays or harbors or rivers with currents, and all had steamboat traffic, which interfered with the races to varying degrees. At these sites, there was a distinct difference between the quality of water near the shore and the quality of water away from the shore. The first thing in every race plan was to get close to the shore as quickly as possible. So once the race was started, every competitor made for the shore. If a sculler or crew happened to be leading, they had the added advantage of forcing the competitors behind them to row in their wash. However, let us return to Lake Deschênes in 1901. As they often did when there was a lull in the races, the CAAO executive and officials talked about the problem of a permanent home for the regatta. Norris King, who had lived in St. Catharines, happened to be part of one of those conversations and made a suggestion that changed everything. He suggested that the association have a look at a stretch of the Welland Canal in Port Dalhousie near St. Catharines, which was no longer used. Nothing came of that suggestion until after the 1902 regatta, which was held in Brockville. On October 31st, 1902, 4 members of the CAAO executive came over from Toronto to Port Dalhousie to inspect the site Norris King suggested. Now, we're not told how they came over. They could have come by rail, but I like to think they came over by ship. It was a 2 to 2.5 hour ship ride. I think the train ride was longer. In any way, I like to think they came by ship. And if they did, they probably came on this boat here. After disembarking, they took a 10-minute walk from the harbor and probably saw something like this. They were used to rough, wide open water and steamer traffic. This must have looked like heaven to them. To help you get your bearings, we are looking south up the course, and the steamship is in for repairs at the nearby dry dock, and it's moored roughly where the finish tower now stands. The bay on the left is now filled in, but in 1903, the races would finish there. The grass-covered strip on the right is a remnant of a towpath from the second Welland Canal. It had been used by horses that towed the wind-powered boats through the canal. The association officials were sold on this site. However, there were some major hurdles to clear first. The practice had been for the clubs in the host cities to organize the regattas, but St. Catharines had no rowing club. In addition, there were no facilities from which to watch the races. CAAO officials returned in March 1903 to outline their plans and ask for funds from the City Council. The council did not act immediately. In the meantime, on April 2nd, roughly 100 men attended a meeting at the Standard Hall, and the St. Catharines Rowing and Canoe Club was formed. The CAAO now had a club to host the annual regatta, but there were no plans for that club to compete. The 100 or so people that signed up because it was billed as a social club, like the Argonaut Club. And they probably also liked canoeing. So that's why the canoe is added to the name of the club. So rowing was not in the cards for these guys. They had no intentions. 4 days later, April 6th, the St. Catharines City Council granted, quote, the sum of $2,500 to the Canadian Association of Amateur Oarsmen towards the erection of a clubhouse and other buildings on the proposed course here, on condition that an additional amount of $4,500 be raised by public subscription, unquote. Two structures were needed immediately, a clubhouse and a grandstand. In addition, piles, remnants from the old canal, had to be removed from the proposed course. CAAO regatta races had been 1.5 miles, but because the stretch of water on the proposed site was not long enough, it was decided that the course should be 1 mile, 550 yards straight away, which, as you know, was the Henley Royal Regatta distance. The grandstand, which was the moneymaker, was finished first. It was a wooden structure which faced east, the same as the current grandstand, but it was located approximately where the finish tower now stands. It was built at a cost of $2,040 on pilings. It had 5 rows of seats and seating for 900 spectators. Lest we forget that we're in the early 20th century, here's another shot which illustrates what well-dressed regatta attendees wore. And here's a similar shot to one shown earlier. I like to think that this is what the CAAO officials envisioned when they first saw the course in 1902. The clubhouse, which was located at the south end of the course near the start, was begun but not completed until 1904. On August 7th and 8th, 1903, the 24th Regatta of the Canadian Association of Amateur Oarsmen was held on the new course. The press had been calling the 24th Regatta a Henley Regatta, and Henley was used generically. In other words, it was being built up as a special regatta, a prestige regatta, something completely different, something reminiscent of the great regatta in England. Then somebody decided, well, let's add Canadian in front of that, just so that people don't get confused with the one in England. So it became called the Canadian Henley Regatta. And then, roughly 2 or 3 weeks before the regatta, some newsman or some editor added the word royal to the name. And every ad, everything every public announcement and every newspaper article used that expression, Royal Canadian Henley Regatta. Even though the association had not applied for nor been granted royal permission to use the prefix royal. So it was the newspaper people that we can blame. On Friday, an estimated 5,000 spectators filled the grandstand and lined the course. The number was doubled on Saturday. To give those numbers some context, the population of St. Catharines in the 1901 census was 9,946. The population of Port Dalhousie was roughly 1,000. The 1903 program consisted of 12 finals. 7 Canadian and 8 US clubs competed. Here's a piece of trivia you can drop into a conversation at your next cocktail party. Remember that I said that the CAAO decided to use the Henley Royal distance of 1 mile, 550 yards? Well, that didn't happen at the 1903 regatta. Normal practice was to lay out a course on the ice in the winter. That wasn't possible in 1903, so the course was laid out using boats, and the surveyors were off by a yard. The competitors at the 1903 regatta rode 1 mile, 551 yards. Okay, if there was no boathouse, where were the shells kept, you might ask? Fortunately, there was a large building which was used for building and repairing gates on the Welland Canal, commonly called the Gate Yard Building. These drawings were featured in the huge coverage of the 1903 regatta. If you rode in St. Catharines before 1967, the building in the bottom drawing will look familiar to you. That was the Gate Yard Building. And since there were no lock gates being built or repaired in August 1903, it was used to store competitors' shells. To sketch the middle drawing, the artist stood on the platform on which the boathouse was to be built. And here is the boathouse built on that platform. In 1904, the clubhouse was completed at a cost of $3,600. The lower floor was used for the storage of boats, and the upper floor was used for a variety of social events, from dances to boxing. It had running water with toilets and shower. The photo illustrates the club activities which were being promoted. There's motorized boating on the extreme left, a rowboat and a canoe towards the middle, and a workboat 4, one of the 2 which the Argonaut Rowing Club donated to the St. Catharines Rowing and Canoe Club. And at the extreme right, sailing. The boathouse, which is called a yacht clubhouse on this map, was erected on pilings at the south end of the Henley course on the west side. The map has one very strange thing missing here. Reed's Island isn't shown. It should be just north of the yacht clubhouse. Now, getting to the boathouse was a bit of a challenge. You could row there, of course, from Port Dalhousie. There was regular trolley cars, and there was a stop right at the boathouse. And of course, you could go by, if you had a car or a bicycle, you could go down Martindale Road, which was at that time a dirt road, except when it rained, when it was a mud road. Now, something that was not given much, if any, thought when the grandstand was built in 1903 was its orientation. Spectators in the grandstand could not see up the course. They could only see the last few strokes of the race. To compensate, it was decided to use a course that had been used in the past, 1.5 miles with a turn, starting and finishing at the grandstand. Competitors would line up in front of the grandstand, row south for 3/4 of a mile, turn around a buoy, and row back to the grandstand. Here's the start of a race, and here's the finish of the same race from 1907. Eights still continue to row 1 mile, 550 yards straight away. That very strong white pole that you see on the far side there was the finish line marker. The regatta was suspended for the years 1916, 1917, and 1918 because of World War I. Every able-bodied man was in one of the armed forces. There were none available to row. The war took a heavy physical and mental toll on the members of every rowing club in Canada. It is estimated that on average, every rowing club in Canada lost 1/5 of its members, and another 1/5 may have been unfit for competition. Moreover, another unknown percentage probably suffered from what was called nervous debility or general nervousness, or what would be called post-traumatic stress disorder today. When the Canadian Henley Regatta resumed in 1919, most of the oarsmen from all Canadian clubs were competing with some physical and/or mental handicap, and they were without comrades with whom they had rowed before the war. After almost 4 years of disuse, the grandstand had to be repaired, the weeds on the course had to be reaped, and the course had to be laid out. The work was done by volunteers since there was no rowing club to host the regatta. Of the 119 men from the St. Catharines Rowing and Canoe Club that enlisted, 23 were killed and 23 wounded or gassed. So there was simply weren't people to run the regatta. The 37th regatta was called the Peace and Victory Regatta. 7 clubs competed compared to 15 in 1915. Those clubs filed 40 entries. Many men did double or triple duty, and a few had 4 or 5 races in one afternoon. Only the junior singles required heats. Of the 18 finals, 3 were row-overs. Since there was no local rowing club to host the 1920 regatta, the St. Catharines Chamber of Commerce stepped in and did its best to organize it. In 1921, the Henley Aquatic Association was established. It had as its dual purposes the running of the Royal Canadian Henley Regatta and maintaining the facilities around the course. Before 1921, the regatta and the course had been the responsibility of a group of volunteers known as the Local Regatta Committee, most of whom were members of the St. Catharines Rowing and Canoe Club. However, it was realized that the regatta was going to grow and the necessary post-war renovations, which the Canadian Association of Amateur Oarsmen were requesting, were so onerous that a separate organization to look after the regatta affairs was essential. The Henley Aquatic Association Limited was incorporated as a company, granted a charter by the Ontario government for the promotion of non-profit-bearing amateur rowing sport, and signed its first contract with the CAAO in 1921. One of its first tasks was to replace the boathouse, which had been neglected during the years 1916 to 1918. Some of the materials from the first boathouse were used in the new one, which was constructed on pilings at the foot of Ann Street. This aerial shot also shows Reed's Island on the left there, which in time would become Henley Island. One of his first tasks was to replace the boathouse. I already read that, sorry. Okay, the one-story structure could accommodate 24 boats. Now, get your bearings here. This is the boathouse in the lower right, and at the upper part of the slide is the back of the grandstand, okay? Now, work was completed on August 3rd, 1921 at a cost of $5,284. We know the exact figure because it appears in a claim for lien filed by the construction company Estrup and Conradi against the Henley Aquatic Association. With legal status came fiscal responsibility. This photo reminds us that there were long gaps between races. Those gaps were filled by live bands, demonstrations of swimming and canoeing, and in later years, marksmanship. To encourage boys to become oarsmen, the first high school race, a working boat for high school crews, was held at the 1922 Henley. Admission to the grandstand in 1922 was $1. In 1924, the Henley expanded from 2 to 3 days, and races were run 1 mile, 550 yards straight away. On April 1st, 1929, the grandstand was blown over in a violent windstorm which struck Port Dalhousie and St. Catharines. it was set up again, minus its roof, for the regatta. This is the only photo I have come across, and I have not been able to obtain the original negative. So I have to walk you through this. The gray you see at the bottom is water, and the black structure you see extending from the left to just past the middle above the water is the roof of the grandstand. And beyond that, above that, where you see the white parallel lines, that is the back of the grandstand. And beyond that is a ship that's in to be taken care of in the dry docks. So what had happened is the grandstand was blown over onto its face. So the Henley Aquatic Association did the smart thing. They detached the roof, took it away, and then set up the grandstand for the 1929 and 1930 regattas. In 1930, in response to perennial complaints about the poor state of Henley facilities, not only was the grandstand in poor shape, but the course had become clogged with untreated industrial and human waste. The Henley Aquatic Association persuaded the federal government, which had jurisdiction over that body of water, to dredge the course. The new width and depth allowed as many as 6 boats to race at once. The second phase of improvements, carried out in 1931, was the erection of a new grandstand, the one still in use today. The steel and concrete structure, which would accommodate 3,500 spectators, was constructed by Aiken, Innes, and McLaughlin. And here we see in the background the grandstand being constructed. In the foreground, we have the St. Catharines Rowing Club Junior 140-pound 8, sucking in their guts and flexing. Work was begun on June 2nd, and the facility was handed over to the Henley Aquatic Association on July 25, and by my reckoning, that's a little under 2 months. The contract was for $29,900, an enormous sum in Depression-era Canada. However, in the space of a month, $28,167 was raised by selling grandstand boxes at from $1,000 to $100 a year for 5 years, and reserved seats in the grandstand for $60, $45, or $30 per pair a year for 5 years. After the second boathouse was demolished on July 27, 3 days before the start of the regatta, the grandstand provided spectators with an unobstructed view of the newly dredged and laid out course. Moreover, it boasted 4 amplified speakers, which carried accounts of the races as they progressed down the course, broadcast via shortwave radio from the press boat following the race. All 3,500 seats in the grandstand were occupied for Saturday's races, and a sizable crowd watched from the banks and in boats along the course. Unofficial estimates put the number of spectators for the closing day of Henley at between 8,000 and 10,000. To give those numbers some perspective, the 1931 census put Port Dalhousie's population at 1,547 and St. Catharines at 24,753. On the Saturday, the last day of the regatta, this group of men did a demonstration row. They were called the Peerless Four. And these are the 4 Canadians who had won the Diamond Sculls at the Henley Royal Regatta. And they did a row by and posed for the photographers. In stroke, we have Joe Wright Jr., who actually was a competitor at the 1931 regatta. And behind him was Bobby Pierce, who was Australian when he won the diamonds, but was now living in Canada. And then there's Lou Scholes, and in bow seat, Jake Godard, the Peerless Four. When the boathouse was raised, the equipment of the St. Catharines Rowing Club was moved to the Gateyard building. There had been tentative plans to erect a new shell house on the site of the first grandstand, which was also dismantled days before Henley. However, when the drive to raise $40,000 for the new grandstand and shell house fell short, the construction of the shell house had to be postponed. The Henley Aquatic Association continued to raise funds for the new shell house, and its construction in 1932 was the third phase of the improvements to the regatta facilities. The third shell house was built on the east side of the course at the foot of James Street, now called Michigan Avenue. And the east side is where the purple arrow is there on the right side of this photograph. It was built by J.R. Stork. Construction began on July 6th and it was completed 9 days later on July 15. The tin-covered building was large enough to hold 16 eights. A smaller brick outbuilding held showers and lockers. It was built for the Henley Aquatic Association to house the boats of visiting crews during Henley. The St. Catharines equipment was kept in the Gateyard building during the regatta. And this shot you can see in the upper right there, upper left, this is the boathouse in question. The young man in the single is Ernie Reimer. The photo was taken in 1933. In 1936, the Henley Aquatic Association signed a lease with the federal government for the Gateyard building, and it officially became the fourth boathouse. And this is the boathouse that anybody who rode in St. Catharines before 1967 will remember. In 1943, to help supply electrical power to industries for the war effort, the Q generating plant number 2 was opened, and 12 Mile Creek above the Henley course was straightened and deepened to accommodate the increased water flow. The increased current helped to slow the sediment buildup on the course. During World War II, the Thin Henley program was supplemented by races involving service personnel and cadets in workboats, cutters, and whalers. In 1944, the event that got the most press coverage was the Wren's race. Wren's stood for Women's Royal Naval Service. It was the first time that women competed at the Canadian Henley Regatta. And HMCS York crew won the whaleboat race. In 1947, the first women's crew to row a racing shell on the Henley course was boated by the St. Catharines Rowing Club. And in 1948, the first exhibition races featuring 2 St. Catharines women's crews were held at the Henley. And this is a shot of the finish of one of those races. The women's program was dropped at the end of the 1948 season for lack of competition. I interviewed a couple of the women who were in those crews and asked if they had considered arranging a race with the Philadelphia Girls Rowing Club. They had never heard of Phila Girls. I also sent a query to Phila Girls and asked and gave them the story of the St. Catharines women. The club historian told me that they had no idea there were women rowing in St. Catharines. As a result, no race ever happened. In 1955, Reed's Island, now Henley Island, was purchased by the Henley Aquatic Association from Maud Gonder for $4,000. In 1958, on November 28, the bridge to Henley Island was installed. It had originally carried traffic on Lakeshore Road over 4 Mile Creek in Niagara-on-the-Lake. In 1961, the St. Catharines Rowing Club Old Boys Association clubhouse opened on top of Henley Island. And you can see it there, and you can see the bridge there. The FISA standard distance, 2,000 meters, was used for the first time at the 1964 Henley. It was meant as a temporary change to accommodate the Olympic trials, but it was made permanent, and the traditional 1 mile, 550 yards distance which was first used in 1903, was discontinued. The first boat in 1967, the first boathouse was erected on Henley Island. New adjustable starting gates were installed and pylons erected at the 500, 1,000, and 1,500 meter marks, of course. I should back up a little bit to 1966. The course was dredged and the silt was used to expand Henley Island. Silt from the course, dredging, and refuse otherwise destined for a landfill site were used to fill in the area inside the berms. The $500,000 federal dredging project saw the Henley course deepen to a minimum of 3 meters. Okay, so in 1967, the Gate Yard building, which had provided temporary shelter for the Henley competitors' equipment since 1903 and had served as the boathouse for the St. Catharines Rowing Club since 1936, was abandoned, and the club's equipment was moved to the new shell house on Henley Island. All of the improvements to the facilities, the dredging, the island expansion, the new boathouse, the starting gates, the pylons, were in preparation for the North American Championships, Canadian Centennial Regatta, which was to be held August 10th to 13th in 1967. It was staged as a demonstration event to show FISA that St. Catharines could successfully host a World Championships, which it did in 1970. This shot is early in 67 because the pylons aren't in yet, and the starting gate isn't in yet, and the wharf isn't in yet. Okay, in 1972, we had one of the most important events at the Canadian Henley. Canadian Henley medals and plaques were awarded for the first time for 3 women's events: single, cox 4, and 8. The 9-member Vesper Boat Club team won all 3 1,000-meter events, and Karen Constant became the first woman to win a singles race at the Canadian Henley. In 1973, the Canadian Henley Rowing Corporation was formed. It assumed all the responsibilities of the Henley Aquatic Association. It now organizes the Henley and all other major regattas on the course. In 1975, the Henley was expanded to 5 days, which continues to this day, although the Masters now have a day of their own on the Sunday before the Henley. Although the CAAO annual regatta had been called the Royal Canadian Henley Regatta since it was first held in St. Catharines in 1903, the Canadian Amateur Rowing Association did not receive permission from Queen Elizabeth II to use the prefix Royal until March 21, 1984. The last major change at the Canadian Henley occurred in 2000, when the old experience plus weight categories were dropped and the FISA age categories were adopted. To get a much more detailed history than I've had time to deliver here, go to my website, goldmedalphotos.com, and click on the history link. Thank you.
That was really excellent, Stan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So sorry to mess up a couple of things there, but
Not at all, not at all. There are a number of people who have been making comments throughout Stan's presentation, and they're all very, very good. We're really privileged to have some really important people in the 50 Stories community with us tonight, including Peter Mallory, and welcome Carol Purser. That we're really honored to have you. And there's, we've done 23 episodes so far of this, and it's amazing how there are common themes and threads which run through episodes that you would never ever think of before. But one of our earliest episodes was on the 1967 women's eight that we call in Philadelphia, we call it the Vichy Eight, which was the first women's boat to compete internationally in Europe. And we did that episode several years ago, but here we are talking about the Canadian Henley, and we're honored to have with us this evening Ernie Bear, who has made this amazing comment. Ernie, can you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you fine, Ernie.
Hi, Carol.
Your
Hi.
printed comment says it all, but I was wondering, could you just elaborate for everyone? Because this is really, really a fascinating story.
What had happened in 1967, TGRC at the Women's Nationals in Oakland won every single heavyweight event. And when we returned from the Women's Nationals as national champions, Ernie Bear, my mother, actually approached John Carlin, who was the then FISA representative from the United States, about the United States women being given permission to row in the Vichy European Championships. John Carlin refused and said, no, the United States women aren't in the same class as European women. In fact, the story he said is 4 Russians carry their 8, 4 women carry the oars, and he said it takes 12 of your girls to carry the boat. And my mother responded, and she said, well, we're always careful because the boats have to be borrowed. So anyway, a month passed by, and my mother got this idea of supporting what was going on up in Canada when Craig Swayze contacted TGRC and asked the girls to come up and do an exhibition row at the Canadian Henley. Well, we said, oh, let's do it, let's go. So we all went up to Canada to do this exhibition row. Well, by the time we got there, the exhibition row had been changed to a 500-meter race, and it was against an 8 that was put together of prior international level gold medal, silver medal oarsmen, one of whom included Tommy Keller. So our 8 raced against this men's 8, and we knew they jumped the start, so we jumped our start ahead of their jumping their start, and we managed to hold them off just to the finish line. We crossed the finish line in a dead heat. And back in those days, things are permitted that would no longer be permitted. And the men said, oh, let's trade shirts. And we all said no. And they said, well, the least thing you can do is give us a kiss. So they pulled the 2 8s together, and the corresponding person in the other boat gave the other person a kiss. Well, in 6 feet was Tommy Keller, the international president of FISA, and he had been rowing in that 8. And he invited all the girls to come to the regatta officials cocktail party that was that night. When we arrived, we were talking to him, and he said to my mother, I want you girls to come to Vichy. And my mother said, we can't do it. John Carlin won't approve our entry. And Tommy Keller said, I'll take care of John Carlin. And my mother said, well, we don't have any money. And he said, you take care of the money, Ernestine. And my mother turned around, and there was Horace Davenport standing there. And she said to him, could you possibly finance a women's crew going to Vichy? And he said, I couldn't do it, Ernie. He said, I would lose many contributors. And he said, how much money do you need? And she looked at me. She said, how much? I said, $6,000. And he said, I'll loan you $6,000. My mother said, okay. And we called a quick meeting of the boat and had a vote. There were 9 people in the boat, including the coxswain. 5 of them said yes, they wanted to go to Vichy. 4 said no, but as a team, we decided to do it. Us rowing in Vichy, because of them having been seen at St. Catharines, that invitation from Tommy Keller, our going to Vichy, resulted in women's rowing being admitted to the Olympic venue. It was a huge thing that happened. So that Henley once again came through. Hi, Jinx, I see it. Jinx
Hey,
is in that boat,
Ernie,
so you can check
Joe
it
and
out.
Penny here. Penny Gibson here.
Hi, Ken.
Hello.
But by the way, I want to
I
underscore,
was in 6th seat next to Tommy Keller.
she's the one that laid the lip locker on Tommy Keller in 6th seat. That's why you
Oh, I
guys
know.
got the invite.
Yes, I remember it well. You did good, Ken.
Ernie, can I ask you a question or ask a favor?
Oh, happily.
I wrote that story in my history, and I would love it if you could read it. It's online, and if there's anything that I did wrong or misquoted, or if there's anything you want to add, please contact me, and I'll gladly make the changes for you.
Oh, I'd be glad to. Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity.
Any other questions for Stan from everyone?
I see Richard McFarlane. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.